I once heard someone say that the deepest kind of loneliness is not being alone, but standing in a room full of people who have already decided that your story does not matter. For most of my life, that sentence described every family gathering I attended. My name is Ethan Brooks, and by the time I turned 24, I had become so accustomed to being overlooked that I stopped expecting anyone to ask how I was doing. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every birthday party, and every backyard barbecue followed the same familiar script. My parents would welcome relatives with warm smiles. My older sister Olivia would become the center of every conversation, and I would quietly blend into the background like another piece of furniture in the house. It was never because I caused trouble. In fact, I spent most of my life trying to make things easier for everyone else. I helped carry groceries without being asked. I washed dishes after family dinners. I drove my grandparents home when nobody else had time. Yet somehow, when people remembered those gatherings years later, they always remembered Olivia's promotions, Olivia's vacations, Olivia's accomplishments, and Olivia's funny stories. I simply happened to be there. The strange thing about becoming invisible is that it does not happen all at once. It happens little by little, one ignored conversation after another, one interrupted sentence after another, until eventually you stop trying to speak, because experience teaches you that nobody is really listening. That Sunday afternoon began like dozens before it. My parents were hosting my father's 56th birthday celebration at their suburban home outside Columbus, Ohio. The backyard was decorated with blue and silver balloons, folding tables covered with white cloths, and enough homemade food to feed 3 generations. The smell of grilled hamburgers drifted through the warm summer air while children chased each other across the freshly cut lawn. My aunts, uncles, cousins, and neighbors filled every corner of the yard with laughter that sounded genuine and effortless. I arrived carrying a homemade apple pie from the neighborhood bakery where I had stopped on my way over. My mother accepted it with a distracted smile before immediately turning to greet another guest who had just pulled into the driveway. I quietly placed the pie on the kitchen counter beside several other desserts and walked back outside without saying a word. It was a familiar feeling, one I no longer found surprising. My father stood near the grill telling a group of relatives how proud he was of Olivia's latest promotion at a large marketing company in Chicago. His voice carried across the yard with unmistakable pride. Everyone congratulated her while asking questions about her salary, her new office, and her upcoming business trip to New York City. Olivia smiled graciously as cameras captured another round of family photographs. I stood only a few feet away holding a paper plate, but nobody noticed. One of my cousins looked directly at me before turning back toward Olivia without saying hello. I smiled politely anyway because I had learned years ago that disappointment became easier when you stopped expecting something different. Eventually, my Aunt Karen walked over and asked the question I heard at nearly every family event. She smiled kindly before saying, "So Ethan, are you still figuring things out?" I almost laughed because people always asked the question as though my life had remained frozen while everyone else's continued moving forward. Before I could answer, my father interrupted from across the patio. "He is taking his time," he said with a chuckle that encouraged several relatives to laugh along with him. Some people bloom later than others. Nobody meant to sound cruel, yet every word quietly reinforced the same idea. I was the family member who had not accomplished much. The conversation immediately shifted back to Olivia before I finished opening my mouth. I simply nodded and looked down at my plate. Years earlier, I might have defended myself or explained that I had been working harder than anyone realized. By then, I understood that explanations only mattered when someone genuinely wanted to hear them. A little later, I stepped inside the house to refill a pitcher of iced tea. As I walked through the quiet hallway, I heard the front doorbell ring. Thinking it might be another guest carrying gifts, I opened the door without hesitation. Standing on the porch was a uniformed courier holding a large cream-colored envelope with an official university seal embossed across the front. He smiled professionally before asking if I was Ethan Brooks. When I answered yes, he handed me the envelope and requested a signature on his electronic tablet. I signed my name, thanked him, and stood silently in the doorway for a moment after he left. The envelope felt heavier than ordinary mail, and the raised gold seal reflected the afternoon sunlight. My heartbeat quickened because I immediately recognized the emblem. It belonged to one of the most respected universities in the country, a place that had quietly become an important part of my life over the previous several years. Printed neatly across the front beneath my name were the words "Confidential Recipient Only." For several seconds, I simply stared at the envelope without opening it. Somewhere in the backyard, everyone erupted into laughter after another one of my father's stories. Nobody noticed that something extraordinary had just arrived. I slipped the envelope beneath my arm and walked toward the staircase, intending to place it somewhere safe before returning outside. Halfway up the stairs, I paused beside the hallway window and looked down at my family, enjoying the celebration. My parents were smiling proudly beside Olivia as relatives gathered around them. From that distance, the scene looked almost perfect, yet I knew there were stories hidden beneath those smiles that nobody had ever cared enough to ask about. I looked back at the unopened envelope in my hands and took a slow breath. Whatever waited inside had the potential to change my future, but at that moment I had no idea it might also change the way my family would finally learn to see me. I carried the sealed envelope upstairs and placed it inside the top drawer of the small guest room that had quietly become my temporary refuge whenever family gatherings became too overwhelming. My fingers rested on the gold-embossed university seal for several seconds before I gently closed the drawer. Every part of me wanted to tear it open immediately, but another part reminded me of the promise I had made only 3 weeks earlier. Professor Margaret Collins had looked me directly in the eye after our final research meeting and said, "No matter what arrives in the mail, do not discuss it until the university gives you permission. Some announcements have to happen in the proper order." At the time, I had smiled politely without fully understanding what she meant. Now, standing alone in my parents' house while laughter echoed from the backyard below, her words suddenly carried much greater weight. I took a slow breath before walking back downstairs as though nothing unusual had happened. The celebration continued exactly as before. My father was explaining to several relatives how Olivia had always been the ambitious one in the family. My mother nodded proudly while passing around slices of birthday cake. Nobody asked where I had disappeared for the last several minutes. I quietly filled empty glasses with iced tea, carried serving trays back to the kitchen, and helped my grandmother find a comfortable chair in the shade. Those small tasks had become my unofficial role during family events. I was dependable enough to help, but rarely important enough to become part of the conversations. As I watched everyone laughing together, my mind drifted back several years to the beginning of a journey almost nobody in my family knew existed. After graduating from high school, I had enrolled at Ohio State University to study mechanical engineering. Unlike Olivia, whose achievements were celebrated from the first acceptance letter she received, my decision barely created excitement at home. My parents congratulated me politely before reminding me that engineering would be difficult and that many students changed majors before finishing. They never intended to discourage me, but encouragement was never something that came naturally to them when it involved me. Tuition was expensive, so I worked nearly every evening at a neighborhood hardware store. I stocked shelves, loaded heavy bags of garden supplies into customers' pickup trucks, organized inventory, and cleaned the warehouse after closing. My shifts often ended close to midnight. Most mornings I woke before 6 o'clock to attend lectures and laboratory sessions. Coffee became less of a luxury and more of a necessity. While many classmates spent weekends relaxing or attending football games, I usually worked extra shifts to cover textbooks, rent, and groceries. My apartment was small enough that the kitchen table also served as my study desk. During winter, the old heating system struggled to keep the rooms warm, so I often wore 2 sweatshirts while solving engineering equations late into the night. Yet those years never felt miserable. They felt meaningful because every difficult day moved me one step closer to becoming the person I hoped to be. During my junior year, I enrolled in an advanced engineering design course taught by Professor Margaret Collins. She had earned a reputation for expecting excellence while treating every student with fairness and respect. On the first day of class, she said something I never forgot. "Talent opens doors," she told us, "but consistency keeps them open." Unlike many professors, she noticed students who quietly worked without seeking attention. After class one afternoon, she stopped me in the hallway and asked whether I had ever considered joining the university research program. I almost laughed because I assumed opportunities like that belonged to students with perfect grades, prestigious internships, or influential families. She smiled and replied, "I am asking because I have already considered it." That conversation changed everything. Over the following months, I joined a small research team developing energy-efficient manufacturing systems. The work demanded patience, precision, and countless hours of testing. Some evenings we remained in the laboratory until security officers reminded us the building was closing. We celebrated tiny improvements that most people would never notice because every successful experiment represented weeks of persistence. Professor Collins treated every member of the team like a future colleague instead of simply another student. She challenged my ideas, encouraged thoughtful questions, and slowly gave me responsibilities I never imagined I could handle. At home, however, almost nothing changed. Whenever my parents called, conversations remained brief. They usually asked whether I was eating well or paying my bills on time before talking about Olivia's newest accomplishments. I never complained because I knew they loved me in their own way. They simply did not understand the quiet path I had chosen. I stopped mentioning research projects because technical explanations usually received polite silence before the conversation shifted elsewhere. Eventually, it became easier to keep those experiences to myself. Even after graduation, I continued working with Professor Collins on a confidential engineering initiative sponsored by several respected institutions. The project required every participant to sign strict confidentiality agreements. I could not discuss details with friends or relatives even if I wanted to. When family members asked what I had been doing lately, I usually answered with something simple like, "I have been keeping busy with work." That response sounded ordinary enough to satisfy casual curiosity while protecting commitments I had made. Unfortunately, my silence often reinforced the belief that nothing particularly interesting was happening in my life. Looking back, I realized that people often filled empty spaces with assumptions. Since I rarely talked about myself, everyone assumed there was very little to say. By the time the birthday celebration finally ended that evening, the unopened envelope upstairs remained hidden exactly where I had left it. As guests gathered leftovers and folded lawn chairs, my father thanked everyone for coming and reminded them about the annual Thanksgiving dinner only a few months away. I helped carry coolers into the garage before quietly saying goodbye. My mother hugged me warmly but absent-mindedly, already thinking about cleaning the house after a long day of entertaining guests. I climbed into my aging silver sedan and drove toward my apartment as the evening sun disappeared behind rows of maple trees. The envelope rested safely inside my backpack on the passenger seat beside me. Every stoplight tempted me to open it, yet Professor Collins' instructions echoed once again in my mind. Whatever was written inside those pages had waited this long. It could wait a little longer. I did not open the envelope that night, and I did not open it the following morning either. Instead, I placed it inside the locked drawer of my desk before leaving for work as though it were simply another stack of paperwork waiting for the right moment. That decision surprised even me, but something deep inside told me that patience had carried me this far, and there was no reason to abandon it now. 3 days later, my phone rang, just after lunch. The caller identification displayed the name I had quietly come to respect more than almost anyone else. Professor Margaret Collins greeted me with her usual calm confidence before asking if I had received the university correspondence. I answered honestly that I had, but I had not broken the seal. There was a brief silence before she laughed softly. "I suspected you might wait," she said. "That is one of the reasons you were selected." Her words immediately caught my attention. Selected. It was not a word she used casually. She explained that the university would soon contact every recipient with additional instructions and reminded me once again that confidentiality remained essential until the official announcement. She never revealed the contents of the letter directly, but before ending the call, she said something that stayed with me long after we hung up. "Your work has been noticed by people you have never met, Ethan. Sometimes the people who truly see you are not the ones standing closest." I sat quietly for several minutes after the conversation ended, staring through the office window while coworkers continued moving around the building. For years, I had measured success by personal growth rather than public recognition because it felt safer that way. If nobody expected much from me, then every small victory belonged only to me. Yet Professor Collins had just reminded me that someone had been paying attention all along. During the following weeks, life continued almost exactly as before. I reported to work each morning, collaborated with engineers on manufacturing projects, and spent evenings reviewing technical reports or reading research journals. Outwardly, nothing appeared different. My neighbors still greeted me with friendly waves when I collected the mail. My landlord still complained about the aging washing machines in the apartment building. My grocery list remained almost identical every Saturday morning. Ordinary routines created the comforting illusion that life had not changed at all. Meanwhile, my family remained completely unaware that anything unusual was happening. My mother called one evening to remind me about Thanksgiving dinner at the end of November. She spent nearly 20 minutes describing the menu, the guest list, and Olivia's latest plans before casually asking if I would be attending. I smiled even though she could not see me and assured her I would be there. She thanked me warmly before ending the call. She never asked how work was going or whether anything exciting had happened recently. I did not blame her. After so many years of simple conversations, neither of us expected them to become anything more. A few days later, Olivia sent a group message inviting everyone to bring side dishes for Thanksgiving. Relatives quickly responded with cheerful comments and photographs of recipes they planned to prepare. I volunteered to bake homemade dinner rolls and pumpkin pie. My message received a simple thumbs up before the conversation immediately shifted toward hotel reservations and football games. It was another small moment that perfectly reflected my place within the family. I participated, but I rarely became part of the discussion itself. As Thanksgiving approached, another envelope arrived from the university, this time smaller and marked with the same official seal. Unlike the first one, this package contained a schedule, travel instructions, and a formal invitation to attend a special ceremony 2 weeks after Thanksgiving. Every page emphasized that the event remained confidential until public announcements were released. Near the bottom of one page, I noticed a sentence printed in bold letters. Family members are welcome to attend after invitations are officially distributed. I read that line several times before carefully placing the documents back into the envelope. A quiet smile crossed my face because I imagined how surprised my parents might be when they eventually received an invitation with my name printed across it. Even then, I did not imagine just how significant that moment would become. The evening before Thanksgiving, I drove back to my parents' house, carrying fresh dinner rolls still warm from the oven. The neighborhood looked exactly as it always had. Children played basketball in driveways while porch lights flickered on as the autumn sun disappeared. Inside the house, the familiar sounds of relatives preparing food filled every room. My mother thanked me for bringing the rolls before immediately asking whether I could help move extra folding chairs from the garage. I gladly agreed. While carrying chairs into the dining room, I overheard several relatives discussing college admissions, successful careers, and exciting travel plans. Olivia described an upcoming leadership conference in Boston that everyone agreed sounded impressive. I quietly arranged chairs around the extended dining table before stepping back into the kitchen. My Aunt Karen smiled kindly and asked whether I was still working with machines. I answered that I was enjoying my engineering work very much. Before she could ask another question, another relative interrupted to compliment Olivia on her latest achievement. Once again, the conversation moved forward without me. Strangely, this time I did not feel disappointed. Instead, I felt peaceful. For the first time in years, I understood that being underestimated no longer defined my future. There was something quietly freeing about carrying a truth that required no immediate explanation. Recognition did not lose its value simply because it had not yet arrived. Some opportunities grew stronger while waiting for the right moment to appear. Later that evening, after helping wash dishes and stack leftovers inside the refrigerator, I slipped my coat on and prepared to leave. As I reached for my car keys, my father smiled politely and thanked me for helping around the house. It was a sincere gesture, though a small one. I thanked him in return and stepped outside into the crisp November air. As I drove away beneath streets lined with golden maple leaves, I could not shake the feeling that this Thanksgiving would be the last family gathering where everyone believed they already knew exactly who Ethan Brooks was. The first week of December arrived with freezing mornings, gray skies, and the quiet excitement that always seemed to settle over Columbus as the holiday season approached. Christmas lights began appearing across neighborhoods, coffee shops filled with the smell of cinnamon and fresh pastries, and families everywhere started making plans for another round of celebrations. My own routine remained steady. I left my apartment before sunrise, spent the day working alongside my engineering team, and returned home each evening to find another reminder sitting on my kitchen counter. The official university envelope remained exactly where I had placed it, beside a neatly folded invitation package that I had finally opened after receiving authorization from Professor Margaret Collins. Inside was a beautifully printed invitation addressed to me and accompanied by several guest passes. The ceremony would take place the following Saturday in the university's historic auditorium. The names of distinguished faculty members and university leaders appeared throughout the program, including Dean Robert Whitaker, whose reputation extended far beyond our state. Everything about the event suggested that it would be significant, yet every instruction continued to emphasize discretion until the official announcement was made. I carefully placed the invitation back inside its envelope, knowing that the moment to share it had almost arrived. 2 days later, my mother called again. This time, she sounded especially cheerful because she was organizing the family's annual Christmas dinner earlier than usual, so everyone could attend before holiday travel began. She asked if I would be free on Saturday evening. I quietly looked at the ceremony invitation lying beside my calendar. The university event would finish around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, leaving more than enough time to drive directly to my parents' house afterward. I smiled and told her I would not miss it. She thanked me and reminded me to bring one of my homemade pies because everyone always enjoyed them. That simple request made me smile. For once, I felt as though I had been remembered for something other than setting up tables or washing dishes. The week passed quickly. Every day, I received another email from the university confirming attendance, parking instructions, or guest information. One message reminded recipients that the public announcement would occur during the ceremony itself and asked everyone to avoid discussing the event beforehand. I respected that request completely. There was something almost peaceful about carrying a secret that represented years of quiet effort rather than personal pride. I did not feel anxious anymore. Instead, I felt grateful. Regardless of what happened after the ceremony, I already knew that my work had mattered to people whose opinions had been earned through experience and integrity rather than family expectations. Friday evening arrived with light snow beginning to fall across the city. I stopped by a neighborhood bakery to purchase a decorative gift box for the pumpkin pie I planned to bring to my parents' house after the ceremony. While waiting in line, I unexpectedly ran into my cousin Michael. We exchanged friendly greetings before he asked what I had planned for the weekend. I answered honestly that I had an event at the university before attending Christmas dinner. He smiled casually and assumed it was probably some continuing education seminar related to engineering. I simply nodded without correcting him. It was becoming almost amusing how naturally people underestimated the importance of whatever I happened to be doing. Early Saturday morning, I dressed carefully in a navy suit that I had purchased nearly 2 years earlier for job interviews. It still fit perfectly. I polished my shoes, adjusted my tie, and placed the invitation folder inside a leather portfolio before leaving my apartment. As I stepped outside, the winter air felt crisp and refreshing. Snow covered the sidewalks in a thin white blanket, while sunlight reflected brilliantly across the quiet streets. During the drive to campus, memories of my years as a student returned with remarkable clarity. I passed the engineering building where countless late nights had slowly transformed uncertainty into confidence. I drove by the small coffee shop where Professor Collins and I had often discussed research ideas after long laboratory sessions. Every familiar landmark reminded me that success rarely arrived through dramatic moments. More often, it grew quietly through ordinary days filled with consistent effort. The university campus looked especially beautiful beneath the fresh snowfall. Historic brick buildings stood against a bright blue winter sky, while evergreen trees framed the main walkways with festive decorations. Volunteers greeted arriving guests near the entrance of the auditorium and directed everyone toward registration tables. Inside, elegant holiday decorations blended naturally with the university's traditional architecture. Soft instrumental music filled the lobby while faculty members welcomed distinguished guests from across the country. Professor Collins spotted me almost immediately. She crossed the lobby with the same calm confidence I had admired since my first semester and greeted me with a warm handshake. "You made it," she said with a genuine smile. "Today is going to be memorable." Before I could respond, she introduced me to several professors and researchers whom I recognized only from academic journals and conference publications. To my surprise, each of them already knew my name. They thanked me for contributions I had quietly made during the research project and spoke with sincere respect that felt both humbling and surreal. For several minutes, I almost forgot how different these conversations were from those I usually experienced at family gatherings. Here, nobody interrupted when I spoke. Nobody looked past me searching for someone more interesting. They asked thoughtful questions, listened carefully to my answers, and treated me like a professional whose work carried genuine value. As the ceremony prepared to begin, Professor Collins gently handed me a sealed program bearing my name in gold lettering. She smiled knowingly before saying, "After today, some people may finally begin seeing what has always been there." I looked down at the elegant program in my hands, then toward the auditorium doors slowly opening for guests. Across town, my family was probably finishing holiday meal preparations, completely unaware that within the next few hours the quiet story they had overlooked for years was about to become impossible to ignore. The auditorium slowly filled until nearly every seat was occupied. Faculty members wearing academic regalia took their places across the stage while guests settled into quiet conversations that gradually faded as the lights dimmed. I sat in the second row beside several other recipients, each of us carrying the same mixture of curiosity and humility. Although we had exchanged polite introductions before the ceremony, very few details had been shared about why each of us had been invited. That uncertainty created an atmosphere unlike any event I had ever attended. Nobody appeared interested in competing with anyone else. Instead, there was a quiet appreciation that every person in the room had arrived after years of unseen work. Soft orchestral music echoed through the auditorium as Dean Robert Whitaker walked to the podium. He welcomed everyone and spoke about perseverance, integrity, and the importance of recognizing people whose greatest contributions often happen long before public applause ever arrived. His words resonated deeply with me because they described the very path I had traveled without ever realizing someone had been watching. After the opening remarks, several faculty members recognized students and researchers whose projects had advanced innovation in engineering, medicine, education, and environmental science. Each recipient received warm applause, while family members celebrated proudly from the audience. I noticed parents embracing their children, friends taking photographs, and professors smiling with genuine satisfaction. Watching those moments filled me with happiness rather than envy. It reminded me that recognition carried far more meaning when it reflected years of dedication instead of a single achievement. Professor Margaret Collins remained seated near the front of the faculty section. Every now and then she glanced toward me with an encouraging smile that somehow communicated complete confidence without saying a single word. As more names were announced, I quietly wondered whether my role in the afternoon might simply involve attending as a member of the research team. That possibility did not disappoint me. Being present already felt like an honor I had never expected. Eventually, Dean Whitaker returned to the podium, holding a single cream-colored folder remarkably similar to the one that had arrived at my apartment several weeks earlier. The auditorium became noticeably quieter. He explained that each year the university selected one individual whose work demonstrated not only academic excellence, but also extraordinary humility, leadership, and commitment to improving opportunities for others. He emphasized that technical skill alone was never enough to receive this distinction. The recipient had to earn the respect of professors, researchers, community partners, and fellow students through consistent character over many years. I listened attentively without imagining that his words had anything to do with me. Then he began describing the recipient's journey. He spoke about a student who had balanced demanding engineering studies with evening jobs to pay tuition. He described countless late nights in research laboratories, a willingness to support teammates without seeking personal recognition, and an individual who quietly mentored younger students despite carrying heavy responsibilities of his own. With every sentence, a strange feeling settled over me. The details sounded increasingly familiar. My heart began beating faster as Professor Collins folded her hands together and smiled toward the stage. Dean Whitaker paused before opening the cream-colored folder. The silence inside the auditorium felt almost complete. Then he looked directly toward the front rows and said, "It is my privilege to present this year's President's Distinguished Research and Leadership Award to Ethan Brooks." For one brief moment, I remained completely still, because my mind struggled to accept what I had just heard. Then the entire auditorium erupted into sustained applause. I heard people rising to their feet around me, while Professor Collins became one of the first to begin clapping. The recipient seated beside me smiled broadly before motioning for me to stand. My legs felt almost weightless as I slowly walked toward the stage. Every step seemed unreal. Dean Whitaker greeted me with a warm handshake before presenting the elegant framed certificate and engraved medal. Cameras flashed throughout the auditorium while applause continued. After the photographs, he leaned closer and quietly said, "Your professors never stop talking about your character. Awards recognize accomplishments. Recommendations reveal who someone truly is." Those words meant even more to me than the medal itself. Character had always been the one achievement nobody in my family had ever measured because it was difficult to display at holiday dinners or summarize in casual conversation. Yet here it had become the very reason I stood on that stage. Professor Collins joined us moments later. Instead of congratulating me immediately, she simply smiled and said, "I told you that people were paying attention." Her expression carried the warmth of someone who had believed in me long before there was public evidence to justify that belief. During the closing portion of the ceremony, several recipients were invited to greet guests in the reception hall. Faculty members introduced me to university trustees, engineering leaders, and community partners who spoke enthusiastically about future opportunities. More than once someone mentioned that they hoped I would continue mentoring students because my quiet leadership had become one of the strongest recommendations supporting my selection. Listening to those conversations, I realized something that had never occurred to me before. None of these people admired me because I had tried to impress them. They admired consistency. They respected reliability. They valued kindness shown when nobody expected recognition in return. As the reception gradually came to an end, I stepped outside into the crisp winter afternoon carrying the framed award and invitation folder. Snow sparkled beneath the bright December sun while church bells echoed faintly across campus. I looked at my watch and smiled. There was still plenty of time to drive to my parents' house for the annual Christmas dinner. Resting beside the award inside my leather portfolio was one final sealed envelope from the university addressed to my family, officially inviting them to a public celebration honoring this year's recipient. They had not seen it yet. Within a few hours, the letter that had waited so patiently would finally be opened, and for the first time in my life, every assumption they had quietly carried about me would begin to change. By the time I turned onto my parents' street, the winter sun had already begun slipping toward the horizon, casting a warm golden glow across rows of decorated houses. Nearly every home displayed Christmas lights, wreaths, and evergreen garlands wrapped around front porches. Cars lined both sides of the street, making it obvious that most of my relatives had already arrived. I parked my sedan, carefully picked up the pumpkin pie in one hand and my leather portfolio in the other, then walked toward the familiar front door. Inside, the house buzzed with conversation, laughter, and the unmistakable aroma of roasted turkey, cinnamon, and fresh bread. My mother greeted me with a quick hug before hurrying back toward the kitchen where several relatives were arranging serving dishes across the counters. "You made it just in time," she said with a smile. "Everyone is already here." I carried the pie into the dining room and placed it alongside the other desserts before quietly setting my portfolio on a small chair near the entrance. Nobody paid any attention to it. Once again, I blended naturally into the background while conversations flowed around me. My father stood beside the fireplace telling another story about Olivia's recent leadership conference in Boston. Several relatives listened with admiration while asking questions about her future career plans. Olivia answered graciously, thanking everyone for their encouragement. I genuinely felt happy for her. None of this was her fault. She had simply grown accustomed to receiving attention in ways I never had. After dinner, everyone gathered around the living room, exchanging small gifts and sharing holiday memories. My younger cousins laughed while opening presents. Grandparents smiled proudly from comfortable armchairs, and holiday music played softly from the speakers in the corner. I spent most of the evening helping refill coffee cups and collecting empty plates, just as I always had. The difference was not in what everyone else was doing. The difference was inside me. For the first time, I no longer measured my worth by whether anyone noticed my presence. I had already experienced something earlier that afternoon that nobody could unknow. That quiet confidence made every familiar moment feel different. As conversations continued, my Aunt Karen suddenly looked toward the chair near the front door where my leather portfolio rested. "Ethan," she asked with a curious smile, "what is that beautiful folder you brought with you? It looks official." Several family members glanced in my direction for only a moment before returning to their conversations. I walked over calmly, picked up the portfolio, and smiled. "It is something from the university," I answered honestly. Before I could say anything else, my father chuckled lightly. "Probably another engineering conference," he said good-naturedly. "Ethan always has something work-related." A few relatives smiled politely, and the conversation threatened to move on once again. Then my grandmother quietly spoke from her chair near the Christmas tree. "Well," she said gently, "why do we not let him show us?" The room became noticeably quieter. It was such a simple suggestion, yet it immediately shifted everyone's attention. I opened the portfolio carefully and removed the elegant framed certificate first. The gold university seal reflected the Christmas lights hanging across the room. My mother leaned forward, narrowing her eyes as she tried to read the heading. My father accepted the frame from my hands, expecting perhaps another ordinary certificate of attendance. His expression changed almost immediately. He read the title once, then silently read it again. The smile gradually disappeared from his face, replaced by complete disbelief. Without saying a word, he handed the certificate to my mother. She looked down at the words before covering her mouth with one hand. The room had become completely silent. Olivia stepped closer and gently accepted the certificate from our mother. "President's Distinguished Research and Leadership Award," she read softly. "Awarded to Ethan Brooks." She looked at me with genuine surprise before asking quietly, "When did this happen?" "This afternoon," I answered. Nobody spoke for several long seconds. Finally, I reached back into the portfolio and removed the remaining sealed envelope addressed to my family. "There is one more thing," I said. "The university asked me to give this to all of you." My father carefully opened the envelope while everyone watched. Inside was a formal letter on official university stationery congratulating our family and inviting them to attend the public recognition celebration honoring this year's recipient. The letter described years of engineering research, academic excellence, leadership, mentorship, and service to younger students. It specifically thanked my family for supporting my journey. My father read each paragraph slowly. His voice grew quieter with every sentence until he simply stopped speaking altogether. My mother reached for the letter and continued reading silently. Tears gradually filled her eyes. Around the room, my relatives exchanged stunned glances. Cousin Michael looked toward me with the same expression he had worn only the previous evening when he assumed I was attending an ordinary seminar. Aunt Karen quietly shook her head as though trying to understand how none of us had known any of this. Finally, my father looked directly at me. There was no embarrassment in his expression, only sincere confusion mixed with regret. "Why did you never tell us?" he asked softly. I smiled gently because I had asked myself that same question many times over the years. "I wanted to," I answered honestly. "But the university asked me to keep everything confidential until today. Before that, I did not always think anyone would be interested in hearing about the research. After a while, I just became used to keeping those parts of my life to myself." Nobody interrupted. For perhaps the first time during any family gathering I could remember, every person in the room listened without looking away. My mother folded the invitation carefully before walking across the room. She wrapped her arms around me and whispered, "I am so sorry that we did not ask more questions." Her words were quiet, but every relative heard them. My father stepped forward a moment later. He looked at the framed award, then back at me. "I thought I knew your story," he admitted. "The truth is that I only knew the parts one bothered to notice." Those words settled gently over the room, carrying far more weight than any applause I had received earlier that afternoon. At that moment, surrounded by Christmas lights, family photographs, and people who were finally seeing me clearly, I realized that the letter had done much more than announce an award. It had opened a conversation that should have begun many years before. The days following Christmas felt different in ways I could never have predicted. Nothing dramatic happened overnight. My parents did not suddenly become different people, and years of quiet distance could not disappear after a single evening. Instead, the change arrived through small moments that carried far more meaning than grand gestures ever could. 3 days after our family dinner, My father called while I was driving home from work. For a moment, I considered letting the call go to voicemail because our conversations had always been brief and practical. Instead, I answered through the hands-free system. After asking about my day, he paused for several seconds before saying something I had never heard from him before. "Tell me about your research." The request caught me completely off guard. There was no rush in his voice and no attempt to change the subject. He genuinely wanted to know. I smiled as I explained the manufacturing systems our engineering team had been developing, how reducing energy waste could help companies lower costs while producing less environmental impact, and why mentoring younger engineers had become one of my favorite responsibilities. He listened quietly for nearly 20 minutes without interrupting. When the conversation ended, he simply said, "I wish I had asked those questions years ago." Those words stayed with me for the rest of the evening. A week later, my mother invited me to lunch at a small family-owned restaurant near the downtown area where she and I had not eaten together since I was in high school. She arrived carrying a small photo album she had found while organizing old closets after Christmas. As we turned the pages together, we looked at photographs from school science fairs, baseball games, birthday parties, and family vacations. In several pictures, I stood smiling in the background, while Olivia proudly displayed trophies or certificates in the foreground. My mother looked at those photographs for a long time before quietly saying, "I never realized how often we asked one child to stand in the center while expecting the other to be satisfied standing behind everyone else." There was no defensiveness in her voice, only honesty. I reached across the table and gently placed my hand over hers. "You cannot change those pictures," I said softly, "but we can choose how the next ones look." Tears formed in her eyes as she nodded. It was one of the simplest conversations we had ever shared, yet it felt more meaningful than dozens of holiday gatherings combined. Olivia also reached out during those weeks. She invited me for coffee one Saturday morning and admitted that she had spent several days thinking about everything that had happened. She confessed that as a child she had never questioned why so much attention naturally came her way because it simply felt normal. Looking back as an adult, she recognized that I had quietly stepped aside many times without complaining. She apologized for not noticing sooner. I assured her that she had nothing to apologize for personally. We had both grown up inside the same family dynamic without fully understanding how it affected either of us. By the time we finished our coffee, we were laughing about childhood memories that had somehow become easier to appreciate now that old. Misunderstandings had finally been spoken aloud. Several weeks later, the university hosted the public recognition celebration mentioned in the invitation letter. This time my parents, Olivia, my grandparents, and several relatives attended together. Unlike the confidential ceremony, this event welcomed community members, local business leaders, students, and families from across the region. As we entered the historic auditorium, I noticed my father slowing his pace to admire photographs displaying engineering projects completed by students over the years. He stopped beside one display featuring our research team and smiled proudly when he found my name listed among the contributors. "I cannot believe I never knew any of this," he whispered, almost to himself. During the program, Dean Robert Whitaker spoke once again about the importance of recognizing people whose greatest qualities often developed quietly over many years. Professor Margaret Collins later described our research project and shared several stories about teamwork, perseverance, and leadership. To my surprise, she spent very little time discussing technical accomplishments. Instead, she spoke about kindness, reliability, humility, and the willingness to help classmates succeed even when nobody was watching. As I listened from the stage, I glanced toward my family sitting together near the front. My father's eyes never left the podium. My mother smiled proudly while occasionally wiping away tears. Olivia applauded enthusiastically every time my name was mentioned. For the first time in my life, I did not feel like someone attending a family event from the edges of the room. After the ceremony concluded, many guests approached to congratulate us. Several professors introduced themselves to my parents and spoke warmly about my years at the university. One faculty member smiled at my father before saying, "You raised a remarkable young man." My father hesitated briefly before answering with complete honesty. He became remarkable because he kept working even when we did not fully see everything he was becoming. There was no shame in his voice, only gratitude for the opportunity to finally recognize what had always been true. During the drive home, my grandmother sat quietly in the back seat before suddenly speaking. "Families do not become stronger because they never make mistakes," she said gently. "They become stronger when they have enough courage to admit them." Nobody answered immediately because there was nothing more that needed to be said. Looking out the window at the passing snow-covered fields, I realized she was right. The award hanging in my office would always remind me of professional achievement, but the conversations that followed would remain even more valuable. Recognition from the university had changed my career. Honest conversations had begun changing my family. Those changes were slower, quieter, and impossible to measure with certificates or medals, yet somehow they felt far more important. For the first time, I no longer wondered whether my family would notice me at the next gathering. I knew they would, not because I had become someone new, but because they had finally taken the time to discover the person who had been standing beside them all along. Over the next 3 years, my life continued moving forward in ways I had once believed were reserved for other people. The engineering company where I worked expanded rapidly, and I was eventually promoted to lead a research and development team focused on improving energy-efficient manufacturing systems for facilities across the Midwest. The projects became larger, the responsibilities grew heavier, and I often traveled to universities and technology conferences throughout the country. Yet the accomplishment that brought me the greatest satisfaction had nothing to do with promotions, titles, or recognition. It began during a quiet conversation with Professor Margaret Collins after we finished speaking to a group of engineering students at Ohio State University. As we walked across campus beneath tall oak trees, she smiled and asked, "If someone had helped you a little sooner, how different might your journey have been?" I thought about that question for several days before finally deciding that the best way to honor everything I had received was to become the kind of mentor I once needed. Myself. Within a year, I established the Brooks Engineering Opportunity Grant, a small annual scholarship designed to support hard-working engineering students who balanced demanding academic schedules with part-time jobs. The financial award was modest, but every recipient also received personal mentoring, career guidance, and professional networking opportunities. I remembered too well what it felt like to wonder whether anyone noticed the effort happening behind the scenes. I wanted every student who joined the program to understand that persistence mattered, even when recognition arrived slowly. Professor Collins agreed to serve as an advisor, and together we interviewed applicants from across the state. Many of their stories reminded me of my own. Some worked overnight shifts before attending morning classes. Others supported younger siblings while pursuing demanding degrees. None of them asked for sympathy. They simply wanted an opportunity to keep moving forward. Watching their determination filled me with hope every single year. My family also became part of that mission in ways I never expected. My father volunteered to help organize scholarship fundraising dinners, using the same practical skills he had developed during decades of managing community events. At first, he worried that people might question why he had become involved with engineering students despite having no technical background. I simply smiled and reminded him that encouragement never required an engineering degree. It only required genuine interest in another person's future. He quickly discovered that he enjoyed talking with students and their families, listening to their goals, and offering quiet words of support before scholarship interviews. More than once I noticed him asking thoughtful questions that he had never thought to ask me years earlier. Every time I watched those conversations, I realized he was not only helping those students. He was quietly healing a part of himself as well. My mother found her own way to contribute. She organized welcome lunches for scholarship recipients at the beginning of each academic year, insisting that every student leave with homemade cookies, handwritten notes of encouragement, and enough leftovers to fill their refrigerators for several days. Many of the students came from families living hundreds of miles away and admitted that her kindness reminded them of home. She treasured every thank you letter she received, carefully placing them inside the same photo album we had looked through together after Christmas years earlier. One afternoon, she showed me that album again. This time, new photographs had been added beside the old ones. There were pictures of scholarship recipients smiling after graduation, group photographs from mentoring events, and one image showing my parents standing proudly beside Professor Collins during our annual recognition ceremony. Looking at those pages, I realized that the story of our family no longer revolved around who received the most attention. It had become a story about how many lives we could encourage together. Olivia also experienced unexpected changes. Inspired by everything that had happened, she volunteered to teach career development workshops for graduating college students entering the business world. She often joked that while I helped people build better machines, she helped them build better resumes. Our sibling relationship became stronger than it had ever been because it was no longer shaped by quiet comparisons. We celebrated each other's accomplishments without feeling that one person's success somehow diminished the others. Family gatherings gradually transformed into something I once believed was impossible. Conversations became balanced. Everyone asked questions. Everyone listened. My younger cousins talked about internships, community service projects, new hobbies, and future plans without fear that their stories would disappear beneath louder voices. My father made a habit of inviting each person to share something meaningful that had happened since the previous gathering. At first, the tradition felt unfamiliar, but before long, everyone looked forward to it. I noticed my grandparents smiling more often as they watched grandchildren encourage one another instead of quietly competing for attention. One spring afternoon, nearly 4 years after the university ceremony, I received another invitation from Dean Robert Whitaker. The university was hosting its annual engineering leadership conference and asked whether I would return as the keynote speaker for incoming scholarship students. Standing once again inside the historic auditorium, I recognized the same polished wooden stage where my own life had quietly changed years before. Looking across the audience, I spotted Professor Collins sitting beside my parents in the front row. My father smiled proudly before giving me a small nod that communicated more than words ever could. During my speech, I did not spend much time discussing awards, promotions, or research accomplishments. Instead, I told the students that some of the most important victories in life happen long before anyone applauded. I encouraged them to keep learning even when nobody seemed to notice, to remain kind even when recognition came slowly, and to remember that true success was measured not only by personal achievement, but also by the number of opportunities they created for others. As the audience stood to applaud, I glanced once more toward my family. They were smiling, not because they had finally discovered someone extraordinary, but because they had learned to value the quiet strength that had always been there. In that moment, I understood that the greatest gift the university had ever given me was never the award itself. It was the chance to help transform one family's way of seeing each other, and through that transformation, to help many other families believe that every quiet voice deserved to be heard. 5 years passed more quickly than I ever imagined they would. Seasons changed, careers evolved. Children in our extended family grew taller, grandparents celebrated milestone birthdays, and every holiday gathering slowly became another reminder that people really could change when they were willing to listen. One crisp autumn afternoon, I found myself driving once again toward my parents' home for our annual Thanksgiving dinner. The same neighborhood looked comfortingly familiar, yet everything felt different. The maple trees lining the streets had turned brilliant shades of red and gold. Children laughed while riding bicycles through fallen leaves, and the front porch of my parents' house was decorated with pumpkins, mums, and a wooden sign that simply read, "Welcome home." As I parked my car, I noticed my father standing in the driveway waiting for arriving guests. The moment he saw me, his face brightened with the same genuine smile that had once been reserved almost exclusively for everyone else. Before I even reached the front steps, he walked over, shook my hand warmly, then pulled me into a heartfelt hug. "I am glad you are here," he said with complete sincerity. "Everyone has been asking when you would arrive." Those simple words would have seemed almost unbelievable to the younger version of myself who used to quietly carry dessert into the kitchen without anyone noticing. Inside the house, the familiar sounds of family conversation filled every room, but the atmosphere had changed in ways that no visitor could have measured. Instead of one conversation dominating the gathering, several small circles of relatives shared stories, asked thoughtful questions, and genuinely listened to one another. My younger cousins eagerly told everyone about college classes, first jobs, volunteer projects, and future dreams. Nobody interrupted them. Nobody rushed their stories. Every voice mattered. My mother greeted each person with the same warmth, making sure everyone felt welcomed before the meal even began. Olivia walked over carrying her young daughter in her arms and introduced us with a smile. "This is your Uncle Ethan," she told the little girl. He teaches people that working hard and helping others are both important. Hearing those words filled me with quiet gratitude because they reflected something far more meaningful than professional success. They reflected the values our family had gradually learned together. Before dinner, my father surprised everyone by gathering the family into the living room. Holding a small wooden box in his hands, he smiled and explained that he wanted to begin a new Thanksgiving tradition. Inside the box were folded cards containing the names of every family member. Each person would randomly select one card and spend a few minutes sharing something they admired or appreciated about the person whose name they picked. Laughter filled the room as everyone reached into the box. By pure coincidence, my grandmother selected my father's name. She smiled warmly before saying, "I admire your willingness to keep learning, even after believing you already knew everything that mattered." The room laughed gently while my father nodded with humble appreciation. My mother drew Olivia's name and spoke about her generosity toward young professionals beginning their careers. Olivia selected one of my younger cousins and praised his determination to become the first nurse in our family. Finally, I unfolded the card I had drawn. It displayed my father's name. I looked toward him and smiled. When I was younger, I began softly. I believed strength meant never admitting mistakes. You taught me something much greater. Real strength is having the courage to recognize them, learn from them, and become someone better because of them. That lesson has influenced the way I lead my team, mentor students, and live my life every day. My father lowered his eyes for a moment before quietly thanking me. There was not a trace of embarrassment between us anymore. Only mutual respect built through years of honest conversations and consistent effort. After dinner, my grandmother asked if everyone would gather outside for one large family photograph before sunset. We stood together beneath the old maple tree that had shaded countless family celebrations throughout the decades. As everyone arranged themselves naturally, my mother looked around before gently calling my name. "Ethan," she said with a smile. "Come stand right here in the middle." I hesitated instinctively because for most of my life I had quietly taken my place near the edge of every family picture. My father noticed my hesitation and walked over. "You belong here," he said simply. There was no dramatic music, no applause, and no extraordinary announcement. I simply stepped forward and stood beside the people I loved. The camera clicked several times while autumn leaves drifted softly through the afternoon sunlight. Later that evening, my mother printed one of the photographs using the small printer she kept in her home office. She placed it inside the same photo album we had once looked through together years before. The older pages still showed countless memories from childhood, moments when I had quietly stood in the background without realizing it. The newer pages told a different story. Families smiling together, scholarship recipients celebrating graduation, community events, university ceremonies, holiday dinners filled with genuine conversation. Nobody stood in the background anymore because nobody had been left there. As I prepared to leave that evening, my father walked with me to the driveway, just as he often did now. Before I climbed into my car, he reached into his jacket pocket and handed me a folded piece of paper. I smiled as I unfolded it, expecting directions or perhaps another family recipe my mother wanted me to try. Instead, it was a handwritten note. In careful lettering, he had written, "Thank you for giving us the chance to become the family we should have been all along. We did not simply discover who you were. You helped us discover who we could become." I folded the note carefully and placed it inside my wallet beside the original university invitation that had quietly changed everything years earlier. Driving home beneath a sky filled with bright stars, I realized that life rarely transformed because of one remarkable day. It changed because ordinary people chose, day after day, to ask better questions, to listen more carefully, to encourage more generously, and to see the quiet value in those standing beside them. The greatest recognition I ever received was not the award displayed in my office or the applause inside a university auditorium. It was walking into my family's home and knowing that I no longer needed to earn a place in the room because I had always belonged there.